Welcome to this seminar on changing views of what constitutes a mental illness over the last 180 years. Technology is wonderful in helping us celebrate the 180 years of the college, and more than 900 people have registered for this seminar. And technology has also made it possible for us to have Dr. Awais Aftab with us. Dr. Aftab is a Pakistani-born, American-trained clinical and academic psychiatrist who has a special interest in philosophy and psychiatry. And he's really doing splendid conceptual work. And I think he's especially praiseworthy in that he's doing this through talking both to psychiatrists and our critics. And it must be a good sign that they both get annoyed with him from time to time, but not always for the same reason. So Awais has a lot to say to us, so I'll pass over to you. Awais, we're grateful for you agreeing to talk to us today.
Thank you so much, George. It's a great honor doing this webinar for the Royal College of Psychiatrists. So let me share my slides. Okay. All right. So this is the topic we're tackling today: conceptualization of mental illness and historical evolution of psychiatric classification. Just a quick word about who I am. I'm a clinical assistant professor of psychiatry at Case Western Reserve University in the US. No relevant financial or other conflicts of interest. I think, as many might know, I lead the interview series Conversations in Critical Psychiatry for Psychiatric Times. I'm an executive council member for Association for the Advancement of Philosophy and Psychiatry. Try to do a lot of educational activities on the intersection of philosophy and psychiatry. I'm also on the editorial board for the journal Philosophy, Psychiatry, and Psychology. And I'm also fairly active on Twitter, so if people are interested, you're welcome to follow me there. So about this talk. So the basic goal is to provide an overview of historical evolution of classification systems in psychiatry, and with a particular emphasis on conceptual and methodological assumptions. So I'm not going to be talking as much about the specific categories in the classifications by themselves, like the particular ways in which disorders have been carved up in different nosologies, but rather sort of like the manner or the methods which these systems have used, and sort of like the assumptions that they rely on. And since I am somewhat limited in the time in which I have to cover this terrain, I was sort of like thinking, like, how can I present a coherent story within the time that I have? So for this talk, we'll focus on the Kraepelinian and neo-Kraepelinian strand of psychiatric classification, and we'll kind of see how that has evolved and how that has changed, and its contemporary relevance as well. And then we'll end this presentation with some general remarks about the future directions, in the context of the present collapse of the neo-Kraepelinian approach, and obviously we'll talk about it more as the talk goes on. And I'm hoping that I can wrap this up within 15 minutes, so that we'll have a little bit of time at the end for a few Q&As. So to begin with, I wanted to sort of like begin with something psychiatrist and historian Hermann Berrius has said, and he has commented that psychiatric nosology, psychiatric classification is populated by unsets. It says postulated, but it should be populated by unsets. And the thinking about and crafting classifications within a given historical period, he gives the analogy of it's like playing a game of chess. So the movement of the pieces on the chessboard is limited by explicit and implicit rules. And he says some moves will not be made because they are forbidden by the rules, others because they are patently suicidal, and yet others because they're not fashionable. The same with classifications. And I think it's really important for us as we think about psychiatry and psychiatric classification generally and our notions of mental illness, that we pay special attention to what these unsets are. What are these things that are lurking in the background that are influencing the decisions we make, clinically as well as in research settings, but they're not quite, we're not quite aware of them. And they're often implicit. So part of sort of like the purpose of this presentation is to talk about some of these unsets in the background. And another thing that is important for us to discuss before we jump into the actual history is this kind of like what we call tug of war between description and conjecture. And this idea is a bit more fleshed out and explored in a coming chapter for Oxford textbook of psychopathology. It's the historical and philosophical considerations and studying psychopathology. It's by Peter Zacher, Konrad Warnke, and me. And the basic sort of like idea is that throughout the history of psychopathology, we have seen these cycles of theoretical conjectures, and when these become too excessive, and when they go, when they're seen as taking us too far beyond anything apparent in an agreed upon sense, then there are calls within the profession to limit claims to what are more readily considered to be descriptions. So we see this back and forth, this tension between description and conjecture happening in the history of classification. And I think this also informs the history that we'll go over. And something that we sort of like elaborate in this chapter, and I'm quoting for that, the more agreement there is on the background theoretical assumptions, the less disagreement there is on what is being described. This suggests that what are considered descriptive approaches to psychopathology are approaches where there has been comparative agreement among multiple parties regarding the background assumptions. And the idea is that there is no such thing as pure description. Even when we are describing, we're relying on certain conceptual assumptions, we're relying on certain conjectural ideas, theoretical ideas. But the difference is that in the cases of descriptions, those conceptual assumptions, those theoretical assumptions have widespread agreement. They're sort of like, they're not contentious in the same way as some of the other theoretical approaches might be. And a similar thing, so a similar sort of like analysis of this tension between descriptive and conjectural was described by the psychiatrist John Strauss in 1982. This is shortly after DSM-3 came out. So he sort of like describes the cycle of the cycle between descriptive and theoretical emphasis and classification. So he writes, there's this periodic flowering of theoretical structures focusing on underlying processes and things like Kohler, Piaget, Freud, in order to progress beyond blind empiricism. A problem with such theoretical structures has been the tendency to expand them far beyond their empirical base. And sort of like, so that has been the problem with a lot of these theoretical approaches, that they tend to venture into the realm of conjecture, where things are kind of like, exceeded by what can be empirically supported, where they're quite contentious. At the same time, the descriptive approaches are not without their problem. These have been accused of being sterile, rarely progressing beyond counting and describing, and coming to dominate their era far beyond what is empirically justified. Of course, even descriptive approaches are more theoretical than is often claimed, since crucial assumptions are involved. And with time, those assumptions, sort of like, which are often like unsaid, often implicit, can become problematic themselves and can be subjected to disagreement and contention. So this tug of war between description and conjecture and the cycle of descriptive and theoretical emphasis will inform our discussion in the rest of this talk. And particularly, we'll see how German psychiatrists such as Kohlbaum, Hecker, Kraepelin were reacting to a descriptively impoverished biological psychiatry. And then critics of Kraepelin were reacting to conjectural excesses of Kraepelin's classification. And then we'll jump forward a few decades and we'll see how the rise of the neo-Kraepelinians and descriptive psychiatry was a reaction to the conjectural excesses of psychoanalysis. And then we'll sort of like see how contemporary critics are reacting to the conjectural excesses of contemporary descriptive psychiatry. So it'll be helpful if you keep this cycle of descriptive and theoretical emphasis in mind as we go through this talk. So just a quick word about the roots of modern psychiatric nosology. A lot of it tends to be traced back to around the year 1682 to Thomas Sydenham, who spoke of a nature in the production of disease is uniform and consistent. He also paid a lot of emphasis on natural history descriptions as a way of outlining disease processes, disease entities. In 1801, we have Philippe Pinel, the French psychiatrist. He classified mental alienation into 4 species of melancholia, mania, dementia, and idiotism. And crucially, he did not see the sort of like these 4 categories as separate entities, but rather as modes of expression of a single disease of mental alienation. And then we have in 1860, Benedict Augustin Morel, who conceptualized psychiatric disorders as varying manifestations of degeneracy. And this idea of degeneration or degeneracy was an important one and quite prevalent in the mid-19th century. And it was loosely related to a peculiar understanding of evolutionary theory. And the idea was that if species can evolve, they can also devolve. And as they do so, this devolution of the sort of like species can manifest in a variety of medical and psychiatric problems. So psychiatric disorders were seen as this manifestation of degeneracy. And this idea of degeneracy was also linked with another idea that was quite prevalent in mid-19th century. That was that of unitary psychosis. And the basic idea of unitary psychosis was that there was a single mental illness that evolved through different stages. And it began with sort of like more mood symptoms with melancholy, progressing to mania, psychosis, and eventually dementia. And what the term dementia meant at that time was something like dissolution of mental personality. And so, in this model, where everything is basically just, one single disease, and it's just progressing to different stages, affective disorders and mood disorders were seen as early stages, and they were seen as more amenable to treatment compared to more sort of like disorganized and psychotic presentations. And this led to what can be considered a 19th century version of early intervention, described sort of like quite well by Eric Engstrom, who's a historian of psychiatry. He writes, in terms of psychiatry's institutional development, the concept of unitary psychosis was a stroke of professional genius because it effectively undergirded what can best be described as a dogma of early and rapid institutionalization. Alienists spared no opportunity to stress that illnesses, if they were identified in the early affective stages, had a better chance of being cured and were less likely to evolve into chronic conditions. Throughout much of the 19th and early 20th century, the specter of further decline into debilitating chronic conditions drove widespread efforts to have effectively deviant patients institutionalized as early as possible. Hopefully, future historians will be more kind to our contemporary versions of early intervention. But this was the state in the mid-19th century, that we have these ideas of unitary psychosis, we have the sort of like prevalent ideas of degeneration, and this has led to an emphasis on sort of like detecting and identifying mentally ill individuals early and institutionalizing them as a way of treatment. one person who was sort of like a big promoter of ideas of unitary psychosis was the psychiatrist Wilhelm Greisinger, a German psychiatrist. And he's also sort of a psychiatrist who's well known for his maxim of mental illnesses are brain diseases. This was a kind of like the approach he took. And he meant that quite literally, that mental illnesses were disorders of the brain, diseases of the brain, that there was some kind of a neuroanatomical, neuropathological deficit that it could be identified by means of brain examination and brain anatomy. So under Greisinger's influence, in the mid-19th century, the focus of most German psychiatrists was on various sorts of neuroanatomical and neuropathological research. Is that they would wait for patients in various psychiatric institutions to die, and once they would die, they would examine their brains for signs of various sorts of pathologies. It was quite clinically impoverished. Psychiatrists in that generation were not really paying a lot of attention to various sorts of phenomenological or sort of like clinical nuances of the presentation, or even sort of like trying to come up with better classification, clinical classification. So there was a big emphasis on neuroanatomical research. And after a few decades, the futility of that approach started to sort of like be more recognized by German psychiatrists. So for example, in 1886, this is Kraepelin, he's saying, Greisinger insisted that hopes for an expansion of psychiatric knowledge rested on the study of neurological diseases. Nevertheless, to date, it cannot be said that our understanding of mental disorders has been significantly advanced by the results of pathoanatomic studies of the brain. And it's remarkable that this was back in 1886, and it's still quite common for us to hear statements like that intensive study of sort of like brain functioning and brain anatomy and physiology has not significantly advanced our understanding of mental disorders. So as sort of like Kraepelin arrives at the scene of German psychiatry, psychiatrists are beginning to grapple with sort of like what to do now. Sort of like, we thought that neuroanatomy, neuropathology would give us answers, but we haven't really found these answers so far. Why is that? Where's the problem? And people started realizing that in part this might be because there has been there hasn't really been an emphasis on natural history descriptions in psychiatry. So we have two psychiatrists, Karl Kohlbaum and Ewald Hecker, who basically offered a critique that relying on vague terms and vague sort of like non-specific terms is not going to help us discover the causes and the etiology of mental conditions, and that we need to do better. That in order to identify disease entities in psychiatry, we need to be able to first describe them clinically and then outline their natural history. So their view was that commonly used psychiatric terms were heterogeneous symptom complexes and diagnostically non-specific. Reliance on them had furthered confusion and led to failure of neuropathological research. Etiological research would not yield results until it was guided by proto-disease entities, determined not only by symptoms, but also by considerations of longitudinal course of illness, basically the natural history approach. And at that time, the general paresis of the insane, which we now recognize was neurosyphilis, tertiary syphilis, was the paradigmatic example, because even though at that time they had not yet identified the cause of general paresis of the insane, its natural history had been described very well. Its specific sort of signs and symptoms, the way it progressed, the various sorts of clinical manifestations it had, all of them had been extensively documented, observed, and it was clear based on clinical description alone that this was some kind of a separate disease entity, even though cause had not been discovered at that particular time. So that served as the paradigm for what can be accomplished if we take natural history descriptions seriously. So they're right at sort of like, at various places. So Kalbaum says the various forms in which mental illness has been known since antiquity and is still known today cannot be considered as different species in their own right, but only as symptom clusters which can appear in the course of different disorders. And Hecker writes, the commonly accepted names for psychiatric illnesses, that is melancholia, mania, insanity, confusion, and dementia, are completely unsuitable and insufficient because these names do not designate true disease forms, but temporary conditions. He goes on to say, the subtle anatomy and physiology of the brain are still in a dismal state. And the pathological anatomy of the psychosis up to now has offered us extremely few hard facts. No wonder we find in mania at times this and at times that change in the brain. Would it be any different if we were to trace the anatomopathological substrate of abdominal pain? And the idea is that, if you're dealing with such non-specific and heterogeneous clinical entities, something akin to abdominal pain, it is no surprise at all that our neurobiological research has not been able to offer us any kind of answers. And it's sort of like, it's kind of striking that even though these sentiments were expressed back in 1871, I want you to compare the language that Kalbaum and Hecker have used with some comments that Thomas Insel made in 2012 and 2013. And he was at that time the director of National Institute of Mental Health. And this is from the director's blog on the NIMH website. So Insel writes in 2012, in mental health, we are stymied by our language. The most obvious linguistic problem can be found in our current diagnostic terms, what my predecessor, Steve Hyman, has called fictive categories. Terms like depression or schizophrenia or autism have achieved a reality that far outstrips their scientific value. Each refers to a cluster of symptoms similar to fever or headache, but beyond symptoms that cluster together, there should be no presumption that these are singular disorders, each with a single cause and a common treatment. The DSM diagnoses are based on a consensus about clusters of clinical symptoms. In rest of medicine, this would be equivalent to creating diagnostic systems based on the nature of chest pain or the quality of fever. Imagine deciding that EKGs were not useful because many patients with chest pain did not have EKG changes. That is what we have been doing for decades when we reject a biomarker because it does not detect a DSM category. And so so what we find is that sort of like we're seeing a little bit of a parallel here that just as Hecker and Kalbaum were expressing dissatisfaction with the psychiatric diagnosis and psychiatric clinical descriptions of their time, saying that they were like so non-specific and heterogeneous that they were essentially useless to the discovery of neurobiology or discovery of etiology. We're now finding a similar sentiment about DSM categories as well, that they're so heterogeneous and they're sort of like so vague and so non-specific that it is no surprise at all that our current wave of biological research has not been able to identify any specific etiologies for these syndromes. I think it's an interesting historical parallel here. But jumping back to sort of like late 19th century German psychiatry. So Kalbaum and Hecker sort of like set the stage with their re-emphasis on natural history descriptions, and Kraepelin comes in adopting that mindset. And in our contemporary minds, Kraepelin is often seen as an anti-psychological brain-based biologically reductive psychiatrist, but the historical reality is actually quite different and much more nuanced in some ways. So Kraepelin, he actually saw psychology as a very important scientific discipline, and it was still, it was still in early stages, it was just emerging, but he saw it as a natural science. And in fact, he studied with Wilhelm Wundt, which in many ways is the founder of modern scientific psychology. And Kraepelin believed that psychiatry, like other sciences, deals with natural phenomena, and that there do exist natural kind or natural disease entities. And the task of psychiatric nosology is to discover these natural disease entities. But we can only do that if we rely on an iterative process of careful clinical observation and follow-up. That if we disregard clinical observation and if we disregard psychology, we're not going to be able to make any progress. So he disagreed with Greisinger's central emphasis on neuropathological research. He did not think that neuropathology alone at that time would be able to advance our understanding, we have to first tackle the problem of clinical descriptions and at least start with proto-disease entities that we have identified based on natural history. At the same time, his classification agenda was quite pragmatic in the sense that he didn't think that he was able to identify those natural disease entities. He thought we were making progress towards that, that eventually we'll get there, but he didn't think that his own classification had achieved that status. And he believed that a big purpose of psychiatric classification was using it for clinical purposes and for educational purposes. So his approach was pragmatic and tentative, while at the same time aspiring to identify these disease entities that exist out there in nature. And as a mention of sort of like his concept of these entities, Kraepelin thought that in such cases where we do have true disease entities, pathological anatomical features, etiology, and clinical symptomatology, which included course of illness, would all converge. They would all sort of like match up and align. And so he writes in his psychiatric textbook in 1899, judging from our experience in internal medicine, it is a fair assumption that similar disease processes will produce identical symptom pictures, identical pathological anatomy, and an identical etiology. If therefore we possessed a comprehensive knowledge, all of these classifications would exactly coincide. That is, like in a perfect world, if we classify something by anatomic pathology, if we classify it by etiology, and we classified it by clinical symptomatology, and then all of these classifications would converge, if we had comprehensive knowledge. So there was a sense of convergence of validators, that we have different ways of approaching these disease entities, and that if we do a good enough job, then all of these different ways would eventually converge, and we would sort of like, we'd be able to identify a singular disease process. Even though Kraepelin, relies on this notion of disease entities and sort of like these are discrete categories that exist out there that we can discover, there was also room for dimensional variation within his classification, and this is most prominent in the case of personality disorders, or what at that time were called psychopathies or psychopathic personalities. So in his description of these psychopathies in his textbook, he writes, these psychopathic conditions which develop on a morbid constitutional basis include an extensive borderland between the pronounced morbid states and mere personal eccentricities. The distinction is one of degree and is to a certain extent arbitrary. And that sort of like these, classification of these psychopathies, these are not characterized by any definitive disease process, but rather by a general deviation from the normal mental life. So we see in Kraepelin's classification that there are discrete categorical disease processes out there that we can identify, but at the same time, within this realm of sort of like psychiatry and the general psychiatric conditions, there are also these dimensional variations, which are simply kind of like more pronounced differences, from normal so-called eccentricities or oddities, and there's no sharp, there's no categorical distinction that can be made. And this sort of like idea that when we're dealing with psychiatric conditions, we're dealing with categorical diseases as well as dimensional variations was a bit more formalized by Karl Jaspers and Kurt Schneider. So for example, Kurt Schneider, he divided psychiatric disorders into diseases, which, on one hand, we have organic disorders, organic psychiatric conditions where etiology had been identified. And then he also included functional psychosis in them, in the sense that their etiology had not yet been identified, but they were assumed to be disease entities. They were assumed to be caused by categorical disease processes. So that was like one big section of disease. And then you had abnormal variations, which included personality disorders, but also various sorts of reactions to ordinary life experiences, or reactions to trauma, reactions to stressors, which could take the form of mood symptoms or anxiety symptoms. And again, these were not characterized by any sort of categorical boundaries, but simply deviation from more or less normality. And Karl Jaspers, in a similar sort of way, divided the psychiatric conditions into three groups: somatic entities, psychological and developmental syndromes, most of what we would call functional psychiatric conditions, and psychopathies. And Jaspers conceived of them as essentially different from each other, without prospects for a single unifying and comprehensive viewpoint from which any systematic ordering could emerge. So there was this idea that we can't generalize about psychiatric conditions as sort of like as just being diseases. We have to be able to sort of like identify that there are these different groups that, some of them are categorical diseases, some of them are assumed to be categorical diseases, while others are simply various sorts of, dimensional variations, more or less different from normal conditions, and sort of like any boundary that we draw is rather arbitrary and based on clinical considerations. So Kraplin's nosology, as we all know, historically was tremendously influential and was rapidly adopted sort of like across the world. But that doesn't mean that Kraplin was without critics, or that there were substantial sort of like number of psychiatrists who disagreed with Kraplin in many ways. So and I'm going to sort of like mention some of the pertinent responses from critics, because I think it informs us of our historical understanding of this. So, for example, Alfred Horsch was one of the was a psychiatrist and a big critic of Kraplin, and in his criticism of Kraplin, he writes in 1912, underlying all these busy efforts is the unassailable belief that even in the field of psychiatry, it must be possible to discover clearly defined, pure, and uniform forms of illness. This is a belief that is carefully nourished by analogy to physical medicine, without any consideration being given to the fact that the nature of the relationships between symptoms and anatomical substrate affords no basis for any comparison between them. So Horsch is kind of like targeting the very idea that why are we comparing psychiatry to internal medicine anyway? So it's like, that's sort of like an unsubstantiated assumption. We are simply assuming that what is true for internal medicine would also be true for psychiatry, that just as in internal medicine, we're able to identify clearly defined, pure, and uniform forms of illnesses, that we will be able to do so in psychiatry as well. But he says that that's just an assumption. We don't know. We sort of like we stress this analogy, but in his view, such a comparison was not justified. And the very idea that we may be able to clearly delineate forms of illnesses, is a mistaken one. Adolf Meyer was another critic of Kraplin, and Meyer was very influential in psychiatry in the first half of the 20th century. And he was skeptical that a focus on course of illness and outcome, as a powerful simplifying principle, could lead to the identification of distinct diseases. So he didn't think that if you paid attention to course of illness, that would be able to tell you, how you would be able to use that to classify the different sort of like diseases as being different. And he also said that social and environmental factors have a substantial impact on illness course, and you can't just sort of like assume that the differences in outcomes that we are seeing, that they are because of constitutional factors or because of various other sorts of biological factors. And he argued that Kraplin ignored not only brain science but also psychological processes, and what he means by that is the sort of psychological processes that Freud and the early psychodynamic and psychoanalytic clinicians were interested in. Is that Kraplin just basically, even though Kraplin is interested in psychology as a natural science, he's not really paying attention to the various sorts of internal psychological conflict and psychological processes that Freud is talking about. And this is evident from the fact that he's not really interested in detailed case histories either, even though Kraplin has kept a lot of records and he has a lot of data which he uses in support of his categories, but he doesn't really use individual case histories as much. And so this was sort of like Meyer's critique, and he went on to develop his own psychobiological approach, which is a prototypical version of a biopsychosocial model, you can say, in the early 20th century. We unfortunately don't have a lot of time to explore that in detail. And then Karl Jaspers was also another big critic of Kraplin, and he thought that Kraplin's notion of natural disease entities was problematic to begin with. And this idea that you would have a convergence of etiology, pathology, and clinical symptoms, he thought was misguided. He thought that even in cases, well-established cases of organic conditions, a one-to-one relationship between underlying etiology and resulting clinical syndrome was rarely found. And he thought that the diagnostic categories, particularly dementia praecox and manic depressive insanity, were too broad, too over-inclusive, and they were so broad that you couldn't reliably distinguish them. And that, while he was writing that, even though Kraepelin presented these categories as tentative attempts at classification, they were being too easily reified. People were beginning to treat them already as if they were separate disease processes, as if they were already identified disease entity. And he thought that this was a dangerous thing to assume, this reification. And again, this sort of like mimics the various sorts of concerns about reification of DSM diagnosis. So Jaspers kind of like advocated an approach which can be best sort of like described as methodological pluralism, is that he took Dilthey's distinction between causal explanation and psychological understanding, and he applied that to psychiatry. And he said that both of these perspectives are needed, that we can't just sort of like rely on causal explanations only, we can't just rely on psychological understanding, but that we have to apply both of them in order to get a comprehensive understanding of psychiatric conditions. And instead of natural disease entities, Jaspers emphasized Max Weber's notion of ideal types, or what sort of like we would consider to be prototypes, a prototypical approach to classification, is that these are observations of a particular phenomena that has been made abstract, a simplification that consists of the most striking and unique aspects of the presentation. And Jaspers cautioned against both neuromythology as well as psychomythology, sort of like, so focusing on neurobiology divorced from any psychological considerations, and focusing on psychology and psychological understanding divorced from any neurological sort of like underpinnings. And he thought sort of like, we have to be cautious against both of these sterile approaches. So we can see that that sort of like Kraepelin's classification and sort of like the way critics kind of like responded to them mimic a lot of the same sorts of concerns, a lot of the same sorts of arguments that sort of like we're still having more than a century later. Jumping ahead a little bit, in the mid 20th century, we have this state of sort of like nosological ambivalence. So Irvin Stengel was a psychiatrist. He was commissioned by the World Health Organization to review existing psychiatric classifications. He produced a wonderful report that I would encourage all readers to look up, because it presents a very fascinating snapshot of what was going on in the mid 20th century. Stengel writes in 1958, recently the attitude of many psychiatrists toward the conventional type.
Can you slow down a little bit, please?
Sure, yeah, I'll slow down. So Stengel wrote that in 1958, so in recently the attitude of many psychiatrists toward the conventional type of classification has become one of ambivalence, if not of cynicism. This attitude derives partly from a low estimation of diagnosis. Classifications based on the Kraepelinian system have continued to be used in some form or other all over the world. Many psychiatrists have done so under protest and expressing their disbelief in the working hypothesis underlying that system. So even though he sort of like noticed that categories and classifications that are derived from Kraepelin's classifications, they're being used quite widely, but that doesn't mean that psychiatrists actually agree with the conceptual and theoretical ideas that underpin these Kraepelinian classification. And there's actually quite a lot of discontent with that, and there's a lot of active protesting and disbelief. So that was, so there's this state of nosological ambivalence. And then another thing that Stengel notes is that there no comprehensive and detailed psychoanalytic classification of mental disorders exists. So even though there's a very rich literature on how psychoanalysis approached mental illness and how it understood it, psychoanalysts were generally not really interested in classification, not really interested in the task of nosology. They didn't see that as being very fundamental to what psychiatry was about. Another thing that was brewing in mid-20th century was a crisis of reliability. a number of research studies had demonstrated problematically poor inter-rater reliability of psychiatric diagnosis, and then highlighted the need to place psychiatric nosology at a more stable footing. And then we had sort of like international studies such as the US-UK Diagnostic Project, which also showed that, for example, British psychiatrists were, their diagnostic practices were very different from the diagnostic practices of American psychiatrists, and people couldn't really agree on what diagnosis to give a certain patient. So in that context, there was a need for more reliable sort of like to place psychiatric classification on a more reliable basis. So one important person in this regard was the psychiatrist Sir Aubrey Lewis. And at the request of the Registrar General of the UK, a committee chaired by Sir Aubrey Lewis was tasked with producing a glossary of terms for use in the UK with ICD-8. And Lewis was in favor of using a descriptive symptom-based approach. And I'm mentioning this here because I'll come back to Lewis near the end of my presentation, and we'll see how we have ignored certain other aspects which Lewis was also promoting with regards to psychiatric classification. So the British glossary, which was published in 1967, served as a template for ICD-8's glossary for psychiatric condition. And ICD-8 and its associated glossary is considered to be the first firmly symptom-based classification of mental disorders, and it had a big impact on DSM-2 in the US as well. So while in the UK, there's this descriptive turn happening, a turn towards symptom-based approach, in the US, neo-Kraepelinians are on the rise. And neo-Kraepelinians were basically a group of sort of like young and dynamic psychiatrists at Washington University in St. Louis. And these were some of the more prominent members. We had Samuel Goose, Eli Robbins, George Winokur, and a very sort of like seminal publication from that group was the publication of the Feiner criteria in 1972. Feiner was a psychiatry resident who was working with these psychiatrists. And this provided basically a set of operationalized diagnostic criteria for 14 disorders that proved to be very influential. And so the neo-Kraepelinian approach was that psychiatry should operate within the medical model. And again, sort of like, seeing internal medicine as something to emulate, as something to follow. And kind of like, the idea was to distance themselves from the psychoanalytic approach, which they didn't see as being that medical. And the idea is that there are natural disease entities in psychiatry. There can be no scientific psychiatry without a serious systematic effort to develop a valid classification system of psychopathology. Such a serious systematic effort requires operationalized diagnostic criteria, which, Feiner criteria provided an example. And research into biological aspects of mental illness is crucial for the identification of disease entities. And again, there was this notion of convergence of validators, that different validators such as clinical presentation, neurobiological findings, longitudinal course, family history genetics, they will all converge when to identify psychiatric disease entities. So we can see, the reason why they were called neo-Kraepelinians is that in many ways they were adopting the same sorts of theoretical approaches that sort of like that Kraepelin had relied on. And Hughes, sort of like, they were openly they were quite open about their preference for biological research in contrast to the historical Kraepelin. Like while Kraepelin had paid a lot of emphasis on natural history descriptions, there were the sentiment among the neo-Kraepelinians that biological research was really crucial in the identification of these entities. And for example, Goose's famous rhetorical question, biological psychiatry, is there any other kind? So DSM-3 and Robert Spitzer emerged within this context of this rise of neo-Kraepelinian thinking, and while Feiner criteria had come up with operationalized criteria for 14 disorder, Spitzer used that approach and sort of like provided descriptive operational criteria for all disorders, even for disorders that had not really been well studied in research setting. And it claimed to be atheoretical, but what it meant was that they were not really taking etiological considerations into account. But this claim of being atheoretical helped mask some of the theoretical assumptions and conceptual assumptions that really were present in DSM-3. And while Robbins and Hughes were very more focused on validity, Spitzer was kind of like more in DSM-3 was more focused on reliability. And DSM-3 also included a formal definition of mental disorder for the first time. And something that wasn't sort of like formally recognized was that DSM-3 was quite deeply embedded in implicit neo-Kraepelinian assumptions, hidden by sort of like, this aspiration to be atheoretical. So this combination of being descriptive while implicitly adopting a neo-Kraepelinian stance kind of helps explain the apparent paradox that the DSM-3 was seen as a victory of the medical model and the biological psychiatry, while at the same time being atheoretical with regards to etiology. So sort of like, at surface, these two things seem to be in tension, but it was sort of like, we can resolve it by sort of like, realizing that even though it claimed to be descriptive, from a theoretical standpoint, there were a lot of neo-Kraepelinian assumptions that were implicit in the background. An interesting thing is that Robert Spitzer actually himself publicly stated that he's not a neo-Kraepelinian. He distanced himself from the neo-Kraepelinian approach, at least in its more strict sense. And some of his objections were that he didn't want to commit that there were discrete disease entities, and he didn't want to commit that the emphasis on biological research was what was needed. So for those reasons, he said that he was not a neo-Kraepelinian. But it is the case that many prominent members of the DSM-3 task force were neo-Kraepelinians, and these ideas were kind of lurking in the background. And so that sort of like, started a new wave of research on hoping that these reliance on these DSM-3 categories would help unlock the secrets that had eluded psychiatry so far. Unfortunately, at the beginning of the 21st century, as the process for DSM-5, revision process for DSM-5 started, it was generally evident that hope had not been realized. So, for example, in the research agenda for DSM-5 in 2012, sort of like the authors write, in more than 30 years since the introduction of the Feiner criteria by Robbins and Hughes, which eventually led to DSM-3, the goal of validating these syndromes and discovering common etiologies has remained elusive. Despite many proposed candidates, not one laboratory marker has been found to be specific in identifying any of the DSM-defined syndromes. Epidemiologic and clinical studies have shown extremely high rates of comorbidity, undermining the hypothesis that syndromes represent distinct etiologies. And also epidemiological studies have not really provided a lot of answers. And this has led to a situation which can be best described as loss of faith in the neo-Kraepelinian worldview. And this is a quote by a psychiatrist, a critical psychiatrist, Dr. Sandra Steingart. And she actually, I came across this statement in a comment she had written on a blog post. I don't think she was imagining that this would be discussed in this particular meeting. I did talk to her before about this and got her permission, but the reason I include that is because I think it captures very well this loss of faith in the neo-Kraepelinian worldview. She writes, I'm not denying that humans experience psychosis or have disabling bouts of dysphoria or extremes of increased energy and mood elevation. I'm just saying that our current constructs map sloppily onto the heterogeneity of human experience. Also, by looking at how we now prescribe our drugs, extremely non-specific to our syndromes, and even more importantly, by examining approaches that seem to be helpful but ignore our diagnostic classification, I am growing increasingly uncertain that it really matters how we define and classify these things. And this, in some ways, is the exact sentiment that Stengel had captured in the mid 20th century as well, when he wrote that the attitude of many psychiatrists towards the conventional type of classification has become one of ambivalence, if not of cynicism, and that even though these classifications continue to be used, many psychiatrists have done so under protest and expressing their disbelief in the working hypothesis underlying the system. So we have kind of like in some ways come full circle to that state of classification ambivalence as well. And I think in here, a prediction by the British psychiatrist Bob Kendall is pertinent as well. He wrote in 1982, those who are out of sympathy with the aims and philosophy of the neo-Kraepelinian school can console themselves with the thought that its present dominance will not last forever, or even for long, if it commits itself to a crude belief in discrete disease entities and ignores the effects of social and psychological influences. And in some ways, we can say that this is exactly what had happened, is that there was this crude belief in discrete disease entities lurking in the background, and there was a general neglect of social and psychological influences. As I mentioned, DSM-3 also included a definition of mental disorder, and I'm just going to sort of like quickly touch on that. Is that this arose in the context of the homosexuality declassification debate, and Spitzer devised a restricted definition that was based on notions of distress and impairment. And even though DSM subsequently also relied on a notion of dysfunction, it is widely recognized now that that notion of dysfunction is very vague, undefined, and quite folk psychological. So the end result is that the definition of mental disorder that we rely on, it's fairly subjective, it's value-laden, it's context-dependent, and it's social-culturally influenced. And the implication is that the boundaries of mental disorder require constant negotiation with society and with stakeholders. And we are seeing that exact same process occur in discourse around transgender identity, paraphilias, autism, neurodiversity, mad pride, that these boundaries are being negotiated just because they're so heavily value-laden. So I said I was going to come back to Aubrey Lewis, and so this is sort of like the reason. So while Lewis was in favor of descriptive symptom-based classification, he also made a distinction between public and private classifications. He thought that public classifications, they're shared, they allow for uniformity of usage, meaningful comparison, epidemiological work. But then at the same time, there is this essential need for private classifications, which are used by particular groups for particular purposes. And while we sort of like his ideas about public classification, particularly ICD-8, became quite predominant, his emphasis on private classifications was kind of neglected. So Fulford and Sartorius, they sort of like comment on this. They say the ever wider use of descriptive classifications beyond their originally intended purpose is an example of what the psychiatrist and historian Paul Hoff has called psychiatry's tendency to succumb to one or another single message mythology. We start out, that is to say, with a perfectly good idea, and then run into trouble by trying to make it the big idea, a cure-all, a sinecure. What is needed then is to return to Lewis's original suggestion, not to abandon symptom-based classification, but to limit their use to the purposes for which they are appropriate, while at the same time recognizing that other classifications will be needed for other purposes. And I think in some ways that is exactly what we're seeing unfolding now in sort of like in contemporary work and some of the future directions that we're seeing, is that there is a need for parallel development and simultaneous use of multiple classifications. We have to abandon the idea of one classification to rule them all, sort of like, as the one ring that rules all the other rings, or insist on naive winner takes all paradigm shifts. So we, right now we have a flourishing of different approaches. We have dimensional and hierarchical approaches by Hightop. We have neurobiological and neuropsychological approaches. We have phenomenological approaches, idiographic psychodynamic ones, we have psychological formulation, and we need to sort of like carry all of them. We need to sort of like let these different researchers, these different clinicians sort of like develop them, sort of like provide them sort of like rigor, establish them. And the idea that one classification can solve all our needs is really quite naive at this point. So to wrap up, what can we gain from this sort of like this historical overview? So neo-Kraepelinian assumptions underlying our classifications can no longer be taken for granted. They're increasingly suspect. Some might even say that they are dead. Our current diagnostic categories are largely pragmatic constructs that we are using for our clinical tasks, that we're using for education and teaching. even though they aspire to be essentialist in identifying natural disease entities, they have not done so far. The underlying reality of sort of like, in psychiatry and psychology, it's very messy. Things are dimensional, hierarchical, complex, dynamic. Things are subject to looping effects. It's socially influenced. It's idiographic as well as nomothetic. And tackling this reality requires conceptual, explanatory, and nosological pluralism. We need a wide variety of concepts. We need a wide variety of explanatory approaches, and a wide variety of classifications. And our notion of mental disorder is highly value-laden and requires constant dialogue and negotiation with broader society and with those it classifies. So I'm gonna wrap up on that note, and sort of like one final quote from a psychiatrist from 1887. He was writing in his book about classification. It may be readily surmised that where the best thinkers have failed to produce an unexceptional classification, the failure must be due to some inherent difficulty of the subject. And it's important to recognize that this is really a very inherently difficult subject, and recognizing that is in itself a form of progress. Really sort of like, quite indebted to the academic work of Ken Kendler, Peter Zacher, Engstrom, Derek Bolton, Bill Fulford, Berrios, and my gratitude to sort of like, various co-authors and collaborators, George Ickes, Peter again, Elizabeth Brisnar, and Conrad Baneke. So with that, I'll sort of like pass it on to George again. And I see that we do have some minutes for maybe like a brief Q&A, and I think we might be able to stay a little bit beyond the hour as well if needed to address some question and answers. So thank you.
Thank you, Wise, for a comprehensive presentation and succinct too. I know some people that may not be familiar with psychiatry theory may have struggled a little bit. So look at the slides that will be available to everyone. I want to start from where you finish and refer to the brilliant book, The Interpretation of Cultures by Clifford Geertz, an American anthropologist. And referring to his own discipline, he said, it's a funny discipline where the more you find out, the more you realize that you don't know. And that the function of science, at least in his discipline, and I would argue the more in psychiatry, is not to shut the debate, but to refine the debate. That's what Clifford Geertz says. Now, I want to start with two things. They're quite separate, but I just want to throw them there and reflect the many questions that you have. One is you've talked about classification, but actually the emphasis has been the assumption on biological classification. And what is striking in your talk, and I think this reflects reality, is an absence of classification on the basis of attachment, trauma, and such things. And I think that is important and is not unrelated to the other issue, which is now that some members of the multidisciplinary team reject classification or diagnosis altogether. Do you want to talk about these things, particularly where you finish and where I agree, which is the need for pluralism, but genuine pluralism?
Yeah, I think it's I think a crucial reason why classification has it's like so much effort has been devoted to it, has been driven by the idea that if we invest a lot of sort of like effort into sort of like into developing sort of like systematic classification, that using that we'll be able to identify underlying disease entities in the same way that we have been able to sort of like do that in other areas of medicine. So there's this sort of like this Keplanian assumption in the background, and in some ways, we've been looking for these simple answers. We've been looking to identify these discrete conditions. And increasingly, I think we're realizing that it's not just that sort of like our tools that we are using to identify these conditions are rather primitive, but rather that these discrete conditions may not exist at all. That sort of like the landscape of psychological sort of like suffering and psychiatric distress may be quite different, and if that is the case, then it's not going to be easily susceptible to any one sort of like one sort of classification. So that idea, once we give up that the Keplerian dream, things become quite messy, and so now we don't have simple answers. Now we cannot simply imagine that focusing and putting all our eggs in the basket of classification is going to provide us with the answers we need. So we need to look at things in other ways as well. And some of the other ways of thinking about psychiatry, sort of like things like psychodynamic approaches, things sort of like attachment issues, trauma perspectives, cultural perspectives, even phenomenology. They're not readily susceptible to the sorts of classification that we see in natural sciences, because there's a sort of like, too much sort of like context dependence, too much sort of like feedback effects, too much sensitivity to cultural and other sorts of idiographic influences. So from those perspectives, it is no wonder that classification is a lesser activity, because they're not susceptible to classification in the same way that natural sciences are, and therefore they're not using classification won't be able to deliver those answers. So I think we're still trying to like navigate this new messy reality that we have. I think classification still has a role to play in this, particularly as providing a common language. But I don't think we can use classification as a stepping stone towards, say, etiology.
Yes, I mean, I think when you come to ideology, it becomes quite important. And I think you are right that people are looking for the big idea. It's human to want big ideas, messianic sort of solutions. That is natural. That is how we are made. But perhaps they lead us astray. And I think it's very important for all of us in this debate to have humility. You didn't talk about the importance, and you brought in ideology, and someone asked why German psychiatry is so influential. And I wanted to bring in here ideology, politics, etc., because I think a lot has to do with Germany had the first welfare state in Europe and perhaps the world, and the creation of the asylum systems. And I'm convinced that without those, it would have been impossible to conjure the idea of schizophrenia, which I find useful despite its fault. Similarly, I think the dominance of biological psychiatry emerged with brain imaging, if you want. So I think there's an interplay both with politics and with technology in our classifications. And I would predict our classifications will be revolutionized, for example, because now we will have remote consultations.
Yes, quite so. And I think, hopefully that not only our classification will be revolutionized, but our very ideas of what constitutes classification would be revolutionized as well.
Yeah, that's what, exactly, yeah. Some people, someone, Tony Hart, asked about the spectrum approach and its advantages and disadvantages. Do you want to say a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the reasons why I emphasize in Kraplin's classification, that there was sort of like this dominant idea of categorical disease entities, but even Kraplin and his successors like Schneider recognized that not everything was categorical, that there was a big chunk of sort of like what we would consider to be psychiatric disorders were in fact various sorts of dimensional variations of things that we see in ordinary life. And because of the failure of the categorical approach to deliver like meaningful results, I think there is now increasing emphasis on the spectrum dimensional approach that, let's sort of like look at things from that perspective, that if there are no natural disease categories, then then most things are going to be on some sort of dimensional variation. So I see that as a timely and important trend. I think these approaches are still rather underdeveloped, just because historically there hasn't been that much emphasis, important resources being poured into that. But we are seeing some excellent work being done, particularly with high top classification. So to what extent taking the dimensional perspective allows us to obtain a better understanding of psychiatric conditions, we'll have to see. But there's no doubt that much research so far indicates that that psychiatric conditions do lie on various sorts of dimensions and spectra.
Thank you. There are many questions, and some go very wide. They ask us about the nature of consciousness rather than the nature of psychiatry. But I will conclude with a comment by Zahir Shah. It's a fascinating topic for a debate, and sadly it's precluded in an hour. But unfortunately, that is all we have. So perhaps we can go away and reflect and keep talking to each other about the very many important points that you've raised.
George, just one final thing I'll say is that I think, there's often a tendency for us to think that we are having these debates for the first time. But in fact, if we go back, we see that, people, even contemporaries of Kraepelin, were raising some of the same points that, that we are raising now. So I think history itself, I think, is a big source of instruction here, as well as a big source of humility, is that I think there are a lot of insights to be gained from studying the history of psychiatric classification.
Well, thank you. Most grateful again, Awais. And thank you to everyone for joining in. The slides are available, and I hope you'll follow some of the references and talk with colleagues, patients, service users, and other stakeholders, and take it further. I learned most from my patients. Thank you very much.
Thank you.